Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, hello. My name is Caitlin Elliott, and I cover true crime cases on Tuesdays and Fridays, with my more vintage cases being on Fridays. So in my last video, we actually discussed Lizzie Borden and whether or not she was guilty, and today we're going to be discussing a more recent case that happened back in the 1990s. Well, 2000. It actually happened in 2000, and it is going to be the case of Tanya Pinette. So, have y'all ever heard about this case? Because when I was doing my research, I saw this and I was like, oh my gosh, I have never heard of this. So, guys, I went down a rabbit hole and it was intense. It was intense. The stuff I researched and I found out, it was just insane. So, when it comes to criminals, most really enjoy leaving their victims' bodies in water to be eaten up by animals, especially when it comes to alligators. And so in the year of 2000, in the springtime, there was a lifeless body of a young girl found in the Lorette River, which was right around the city of Quebec in Canada. This case would eventually unfold to become the most twisty and turning case about finding out who this girl's identity was, and my god, it is just insane. So in the city of Quebec, there's actually a small local community, and it's called Lancy and Lorette. It's said to be a very quiet area, and nothing ever really happens there. So it was considered to be a safe community for families to live in. But on April 7th of 2000, there would be a change. So two young children, they were walking around in the wooden area going to school that day when they stumbled upon something that they believed to have been a mannequin. This was by the river going to school. And if anyone has ever watched any of my previous videos, or anyone knows, a majority of the time if you see what seems to be a mannequin in the water, majority of the time it is not a mannequin, but something else. The girls are obviously very curious, and they decide to go and investigate to figure out what exactly this was, why there was a mannequin, as they believed, in the water at the time. So when they inched forwards, they were horrified to realize that this was not a mannequin, but in fact a deceased body. The girls, who were absolutely horrified at this point, they quickly made their way to school to inform any type of teachers about their discovery. The teacher quickly called the police, and the Quebec authorities are informed about two students who found a body in the woods going to school. The police are very concerned because obviously it's a dead body, so they try to travel to the location as quickly as possible. Two detectives quickly begin their investigation to figure out what happened to the Jane Doe. The lead detective on this case stated that the area needed to be secured to prevent contamination of the crime scene by locals who were just curious and pop up there just to see what was going on. There was a forensic investigator who traveled to the scene of the crime and took hundreds of photos at the time, and this was supposed to document the evidence at the crime scene. The body that had been found was on a group of rocks by the side of the stream pretty far away, so it's possible that the body may have just traveled downstream and ended up being found there. The body, it was still fully clothed, and it was discovered that the clothes that the doe was wearing was appropriate for this weather. So the detective turns the body over and is shocked to realize that this body belonged to a young girl. So this girl's body was said to not be too decomposed at all, and it was possibly due to the fact that she was in the water and the water was cold, which could have been able to preserve her body. So because the girl was considered to be fully clothed, there was no sign of abuse at the time, and it was not at all sexually motivated in nature. The police decided to search the body of the girl, and they found some very interesting wounds to her neck and throat area. So upon further analysis, they discovered that she had been violently stabbed several times with a knife in her throat and chest area. So after they did the further analysis, they did not figure out whether or not the stabbings killed her or if maybe she had drowned. So despite not knowing her cause of death, it was still listed as a homicide. After the evidence was collected, her body was ultimately removed from the river. Once this was done, the detectives decided they were going to try to do everything they could to bring help to identify her. Unfortunately, if there is a victim that has no identification, investigators have nothing to go off of when it comes to cases like that. However, soon there would be a note found in the pocket of the young girl's jeans, and this would help lead to the discovery of the whole case and just solve the whole thing. The note was revealed to be a telephone number written in pen on a piece of paper, and despite the fact that the dough was found in water, the pen had not been smeared at all. So along with this phone number were also pieces of paper which was revealed to be a bus ticket. The body was removed from the water, and ultimately the young girl was pronounced deceased by a coroner at the scene. The female's body was then transferred to the local morgue in Quebec City, Canada. Authorities tried to determine whether or not she had been killed, and due to the debris in the river and everything, it was said that her body wasn't able to be moved far. Authorities decided to travel upstream from where her body had been found and try to discover whether or not there could be any clues that could, help figure out who this girl was. Dozens of items were eventually collected by forensic investigators at the scene of the crime, and they began to search for any type of clues connected to the crime. Several hours later, an investigator ended up finding a very important piece of evidence, which was a carving engraved into a tree that read, Emilio, with a heart and an arrow going through it, TP. And that's not toilet paper. It's not. When this was found, authorities were super excited this could possibly be useful for discovering who the doe's identity was. The carving was said to have actually occurred pretty recently, and it was said that due to the bark and everything growing on the tree, there had not been a lot of bark growing where this carving was, which meant that it had to happen recently. There was a photographer with the investigators who took a lot of pictures of the carving. These pictures were then placed into a file to be looked over in the case, but unfortunately nothing ever came from this to help identify the girl. The following day, her body was transported to a morgue located in Montreal, Canada, to check and make sure if there was any evidence that had been missed. After this, the workers got fingerprints of the doe, and they tried to make an identification of the young lady's body. Despite the victim being so young, no one had reported a girl missing with her description in the past few days. However, it is possible that her family didn't even know that she was missing, so they weren't able to report her missing. So the girl, she seemed to be quite young, like young enough to even be in school. So even if, authorities were like unable to find out who this girl's parents were or anything like that, and she was young enough and she would have ran away, someone should have reported her missing. That's just me. So they wanted to figure out who exactly this girl was. So the paper that was located in the girl's pocket revealed itself to be a person's name and a phone number. So authorities believe this could help determine the identification of the doe and who her killer could have been. They start to establish the relationship between the name and the phone number and the Jane Doe, launching in a formal investigation into her death. They decide to trace the address belonging to the phone number in hopes of solving this case, and once it was done, the number was traced back to a home in St. Roch, Quebec. St. Roch is said to be one of the oldest neighborhoods in Quebec City, Canada. It's said that despite it being an older neighborhood, a majority of the residents living in St. Roch were drug addicts and prostitutes. The police detectives arrived at the home of the woman behind the phone number and presented her with the photos of the Jane Doe at the morgue. And this was in hopes that the woman would be able to provide them with any type of information that could lead to her identity. The victim was absolutely stunned, and she confirmed that she did in fact know who this doe was, and that there were articles belonging to her, the woman, that the doe had been found wearing. She claimed that she had loaned these clothing articles to a young girl named Tanya Pinette, which provided the detectives with a possible identification of this doe. The woman told authorities that she had only met Tanya Pinette really recently, and she felt sorry for her and allowed the young girl to stay with her. She stated to authorities that Tanya had left her backpack in the woman's home, claiming that she would come back to retrieve it, but unfortunately she never did. Tanya Pinette, the unnamed woman who loaned Tanya Pinette those exact clothes on the day of March 30th of 2000, was horrified to figure out that the girl that had been wearing these clothes possibly was deceased. Tanya had told her that she was planning on traveling to a place called L'Ancienne-Lorette in order to see her boyfriend, but based off the tone of the voice that Tanya was using and her body language, she could tell that she just did not want to go back to her boyfriend. Due to the information that provided to the detectives by this woman, they discovered that Protective Services had placed Tanya at a shelter for young women. And at the time, Tanya was only 15 years old. The detective in charge of the case quickly contacts the shelter in hopes of any information that could be helpful to the case and help verify the identification of this doe. An official traveled to the youth center, traveled from the youth center down to the morgue in hopes of identifying the young girl, and just a few hours later, Tanya Pinette was positively identified as this Jane Doe. After this identification, there were now witnesses who knew her during the time of November of 1999 as her time as a runaway. It always bothers me, like seriously, whenever there's young teens and young children that run away and ultimately, you know, they get killed or something happens to them. Like, what are they running away from? Are they being abused at home? Like, it just upsets me to no end. Like, I feel so bad for them. So, authorities met up with friends of Tanya's sister. Met up with friends of Tanya's when she was a runaway and decided to speak to Tanya's sister while she was residing at a local stopover center for young women in need. She tells authorities that at the time of her disappearance, Tanya had been in a relationship with someone named Jesse Alabaraway. It was said that Jesse and Tanya had been living together at the time that she was murdered. And Tanya had been feeling pretty homesick at one point. She just wanted to stop running and just go back to her home. So she brought this up to Jesse and said, hey, you know, I want to go back home to my family in Quebec City. Let's just stop running. Let's just go back home. And when Jesse got told this by Tanya, he was pissed. He was so furious. He was like, no, you're not allowed to leave me. You're not allowed to go home. And if you ever do leave me, I am going to kill you. That was directly quoted from him. The authorities sent 2 detectives to speak with Jesse Barraway and were said to have met him in their office. So he went over to meet with them in their office at the time. Jesse claimed that, you know, he wasn't interested in coming in, but eventually he called his lawyer and his lawyer convinced him to go in. Jesse had told authorities that he had not seen Tanya in over a week and had no idea where she could possibly have been, which is just suspicious to me because, you know, he says, you know, I haven't seen her, like my girlfriend, in, you know, a week, but it's fine. And it just doesn't make any sense to me because if she was in fact living with this guy, wouldn't he know that she is, you know, missing? Like, oh, she didn't come home for dinner that night. That's a little weird. That's a little out of her character. It just does not make any sense to me. It makes him really suspicious sounding. So he said that her father had eventually traveled to visit them and stayed with the couple for a couple of days. But after an argument occurred between Jesse and Tanya's father, Jesse kicked them both out of his house and told him that they were not welcome to come back and see them. So pretty quickly, all the information that the detectives have to go off of points to Jesse as a possible suspect. Despite all of this, the investigators still need to find proof that Jesse is in fact the prime suspect and the killer. So the autopsy reports become available quickly, and the police hope to be able to find a cause of death for Tanya, but there are no signs or evidence of assault or a male profile detected, which means she hadn't been, you know, raped, by someone, and they couldn't get any type of evidence from sperm to link into a database, so everyone was just so upset and frustrated at this point. There were 8 stab wounds on her body that were about 1 centimeter deep on the right side of her neck, with 2 of those wounds actually puncturing a very important neck artery. These wounds would have possibly been fatal and could have caused her death, but the official cause of death for Tanya was said to have been drowning. No one in the police force knew that if Tanya had just accidentally drowned herself, like maybe, she could have just slipped and fell, or she could have drowned looking for help, or maybe she was forcibly drowned by her own attacker. So, and oddly enough, when a detective spoke to Jesse about the whole case about his girlfriend, she claimed that he had a knife on him, which corresponds with the stab wounds found on Tanya Pinette's body. So, link right there. Tanya was said to have a previous history of self-harm. It said that it's not possible. They're not sure if she was, in fact, still going through the self-harm stage whenever she was murdered, but no one knows if this could be connected to it. But they said that because of these wounds, they needed to see if she had, in fact, caused them herself or someone else could have caused them. So, when searching the original crime scene to see if she had, in fact, been murdered, so when they went back to check and see if she had in fact been murdered, they have to find a murder weapon. So if she had in fact killed herself, obviously she's going to have the weapon right there near her. But if she was murdered, someone else would have possibly have taken the murder weapon to try to prevent them from being connected to her case. And this was what the detectives wanted to find out. So unfortunately, the water in the river was way too murky for anyone to see anything and search for any type of a weapon or a knife. So detectives then decide that the best thing to do is to quickly dam the river and just find any type of clues in the area that her body was found in by using a tarp that could bring up any type of weapons under the water and bring them to the surface. So the river was then pumped out onto the riverbed, so that there were now an extra 200 square feet of search area. Once this was installed, the barrier actually remained up for about 5 to 6 hours in order to collect any evidence from the river over a period of time. So even though it was said that there was not a lot of water in the riverbed where Tanya was said to have drowned, authorities still decided to use metal detectors just in case of something that could have popped up. This was said to have made it easier to search through the murky waters, and this was done to look for any type of clues. At this point, authorities were still uncertain as to whether or not she had committed suicide or if she was a victim of foul play due to how her body had been discovered and the fact the murder weapon was not there. They theorized that if she did commit suicide, it's possible that the weapon did in fact sink into the river, and that is exactly what they're trying to locate at this point. So there was a search of the apartment where Tanya and her boyfriend Jesse had lived at the time. What was really bizarre was just that just after Tanya either went missing or was killed, Jesse sold his apartment and moved back in with his mother. And I understand that everybody goes through different stages of grief. I just find it quite bizarre that, my girlfriend's missing, she's been found deceased, so I'm just going to sell everything and move back in with my mother right away. I don't know, it's just so weird to me. It really is. Because Jesse had moved out of his apartment, the authorities no longer needed to obtain a search warrant for his property to look for any type of evidence that Tanya had been there. So this was actually pretty exciting for the authorities because they were able to just walk in and get all the clues they needed and then to go home. So the detectives wanted to truly determine whether or not Tanya had in fact been murdered at the apartment or something could have happened at the river. So the forensic workers who arrived with the detectives at the time began to search for any type of blood stains that they could, even on dark pieces of furniture, in case she had been sitting there or touching it or grabbing at it, trying to save herself. It's a possibility she could have touched that. So even on dark pieces of furniture, blood stains can still be found, and one forensic investigator decided to use luminol to try to find any traces of blood. So luminol, when used in the dark, shows up as a blue-green light, but when blood is present, it would show up as dark blue instead. When using the luminol in the home, there were only small traces of blood found on a bed mattress. The 2 blood spots were only said to have been about 2 inches wide, so there was not a lot that detectives could go off of with this. The detectives then leave for the lab in Montreal, Canada with the evidence, and over a past few days, it was analyzed in the laboratory. So it's said that over time, there was a blood sample taken from the deceased, from Tanya, to compare to the blood found on this mattress. And there was a combination of her blood and someone else's blood belonging to an unknown male and Tanya Pinette on this mattress. So because Tanya was said to have been sleeping there quite often, scientists believe that it's possible that this blood could have been menstruation blood, which is a possibility. So, despite all of this DNA evidence relating to Tanya, there was not enough evidence to prove that she had in fact been there at the apartment and that the apartment could be related to her death. So, authorities and investigators decide that the crime had ultimately occurred at the Lorette River. So, they realized that, there could be these blood stains here. They're probably menstruation blood, but the crime must have happened over at the river. So, the clothing that Tanya had been wearing was returned back to the police in Montreal, and the clothes were then dried before being separated into individual bags. The detectives then researched the pockets of Tanya's jeans that she had been wearing that day and found 2 dried balls of paper. The ink on the paper were smeared, obviously, because it was waterlogged, and water and ink can, it just becomes smeared and you can't really read what's going on. So, this made it almost impossible for them to work with, and they were just so frustrated because now they have these pieces of paper and they can't read what was happening. On May 17th of 2000, the local police conduct an official search of Jesse's mother's home for any type of clues that could connect to Tanya's death. The authorities then collect as many of Jesse's clothes as they possibly could to find any type of DNA evidence. The evidence that they do find is then brought to forensic science lab in Montreal, Canada, to compare it to Tanya's DNA. The detectives decide to perform a search for blood on the clothes and boots that belonged to Jesse to match the bloodstains that were found in the apartment. But unfortunately, the results came up negative, which meant that there were no bloodstains on his clothes or his shoes. When there was a deeper examination of the pocket knife that was found, it was said that the knife had 0 bloodstains on it as well. The knife had been considered to be a Swiss Army knife with blades similar to the width of Tanya's wounds on the right side of her body. So in her neck and in her abdomen, just everywhere that she was stabbed, the knife blade seemed to match the length of the stabbing wounds. So the knife is then analyzed to an attempt to locate Tanya's blood in case that this could have been the murder weapon. So when analyzed, it was discovered that there was in fact a slight discoloration to the metal blade, which could have been done due to blood and iron in the blood, which can cause things to rust. To the authorities, this was suspicious because it looked like that it just seems similar to a bunch of dried blood. So they were just having some alarm bells go off in their heads like, ding, 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 this looks like dried blood. This could have been a murder weapon. So it was proven that there was, in fact, blood stains on the blade, but it seemed like the knife had been washed previously at some point to try to get rid of the evidence, but it seemed like whoever did this really didn't do a very good job of it because they could still find little traces of the blood. The bloodstains on the knife were then analyzed and then proven to 100% match the victim Tanya's DNA. So bam bam, now Jesse is now officially linked to the murder of Tanya, and this is proven to be 100%. He is now officially matched. 11111. That it was just bang, 100% done. So this was a major break in the case, and this is what the investigators really needed to pin the murder against Jesse. So the detectives, they needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was in fact the one behind the murders, because you can't just say, oh, we found this, we need to make sure. Seriously, they need to make sure that the evidence against him is strong enough to take him to court and have him put behind bars. So there was not a single witness to this murder, no one that could verify that Jesse was in fact the person that was with Tanya that day, the one that had, brutally stabbed her, had killed her. There was just not enough, there was just no witnesses, no one that could step forward and be like, it was him. All they had to go off of at the time was the blade. So it was extremely difficult for them. When police began to interrogate Jesse, they already knew about all the evidence that they had against him, but if they did one little slip up, he would know about it, and this could ruin everything that they had against him. So the authorities really needed to know if their suspect is guilty, because if they're not guilty, it just, they had to start all over from square one. The balls of paper that were found in Tanya's pockets were then re-examined right after her autopsy. They were put into cups of water to see if this would bring up any type of words, and this was done overnight very gently so that nothing could rip. And the very next day, the paper balls were opened up and they were dried out, and this revealed them to be 2 pieces of a bus transfer, which is a ticket basically bought that if you were to travel by like a county bus or a county commuter, you would buy one of these tickets and you would have it with you, so you'd be able to get on the bus and go where you needed to go. So everything on this bus ticket was now able to be put together so that it be professionally photographed by forensic investigators. And the photo was later developed, and this was given back to the investigators. The detectives met up with the people from the Quebec Transit Service, where the bus depot workers gave authorities a description of the type of tickets that they had used. So they were saying, oh, our ticket looked like this was a square, it said the Polar Express on it, and hole punches. So they were just trying to make sure that this matched exactly, what was found and what was used. So the workers, they gave a description of what the ticket would look like, along with the fact that they used a unique hole punch code that each drivers had for their tickets. So a different driver would have a different hole punch code. So this could actually help determine which bus Tanya had ridden on and what driver could have been driving that bus, and whether or not someone had seen her on that bus. So detectives find the bus driver, but no one could prove or recall if Tanya had in fact been on that bus that day, since a lot of Quebec citizens like to travel by bus. Quebec is considered to be one of the biggest cities in the entire country of Canada. It's huge. And with people traveling by bus, it can get confusing to figure out what an individual looks like, because you got so many people going on this bus, going off this bus, going to different places, that it can all blur together. So obviously, the bus driver couldn't recall what this woman looked like off the top of his head. So he was just like, well, not sure. But it is enough evidence that she had in fact been on a bus that day. So however, this ticket does correspond with what the woman had stated when she told authorities about Tanya coming to visit her in her home. On March 30th of 2000, Tanya Pinette had taken a bus in the direction of Lancia and Lorette before her life was taken, which just, again, proves that she was in fact, murdered probably by Jesse. So things are not looking good for them. And the very last piece of the puzzle that was to be analyzed was supposed to be the carving on the tree. Remember the carving on the tree that was found near where her body was? So what was even more compelling was that when it said TP Heart Emilio is said to be Jesse's nickname. And the two of them, Jesse and Tanya, were very, they knew the area very well, I guess I should say. They knew where to go. They were familiar with the area. So Jesse knew exactly where this carving could have been. So after all of this, all of the evidence was enough to press charges against him. By this point, authorities considered Jesse Ali Barroway, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, as their prime suspect in Tanya's murder. But unfortunately, there was absolutely no witnesses to the crime. So even if they did do that, there was no one who could come forward and say, I saw him do that. The local authorities decided to narrow down their suspects list and try to just weed out all the people that they could who they considered to be connected to the case, but turns out they're not connected to the case. So these people were all proved to not be involved in the murder of Tanya, and Jesse was left as the only one on the official suspects list. So, there you go. When the investigators arrived at his house and, presented him with the fact that, hey, you've been matched to DNA found on Tanya Pinette's body, he demanded that he would not be arrested unless there was a warrant that could be issued for him for his arrest. He was like, I'm not going anywhere with you until you can prove to me that there's a warrant for my arrest. That sounds like suspiciousness to me. On May 11th of 2001, Jesse Barroway was arrested for the murder of his 15-year-old girlfriend, Tanya Pinette. When he was arrested, authorities were absolutely stunned to realize that he had no real reaction to the charges brought forward to him. They were like, oh, you're being charged with murder. He was just like, cool. It just seemed really weird to them. So Jesse is then read his rights by the police, and after 10 intense hours of questioning by the detectives and by the authorities, he breaks down and just tells everyone what they need to know. So he says, I want to explain what happened that day of the murder of Tanya Pinette. And authorities remind him that he does, in fact, have the right to get a lawyer. Do you want us to call a lawyer for you? Ring, ring, ring. And he says, no, I just need to get this off my chest. I need to tell you guys the truth. And he does not want a lawyer present. So Jesse explains to the authorities that on the day of the murder, he and his girlfriend Tanya had visited the riverbank together on a date. They had hiked to a secluded spot where the tree was by the riverbank, and they carved their initials into the piece of the trunk with Jesse's pocket knife he had. Jesse then tells Tanya that he is just absolutely in love with her. He wants to marry her. She is basically the sun in his eyes. She is basically the whole sun, the one that lights up his world. The world revolves around Tanya in his mind. So it's not exactly what happened. It's not exactly sure what happened leading up to this, but at one point, Jesse just becomes extremely jealous and just starts accusing Tanya of being a prostitute and a slut, which I'm not all sure why he would just straight up say this, I love you, and then goes, you're a prostitute and you're a slut and you sleep with everyone. It doesn't make any sense to me. So Tanya becomes understandably just enraged with Jesse's behavior. Why is he acting like this? And she tries to slap him no, you're not going to talk to me like that. So that's when Jesse grabs her arm before she is able to hit him. And he starts just violently stabbing her in the neck with his pocket knife. So Tanya was then left to die as he quickly fled the scene of the crime, and eventually she did in fact die, and he didn't even care that she was laying there, injured. He had done this. He didn't even give a rat's ass. He just left left her there, and it's so heartbreaking. So Tanya, who is still alive at this point, begins crawling with all the energy that she has. She is fighting to stay alive, just crawls over to the river just to try to wash off her wounds. And this is when she sadly succumbs to her injuries by drowning. So the authorities now have only 24 hours to bring Jesse into a judge to, bring forth the charges and, officially charge him with the murder. So according to the Quebec Code of Law, you have to bring an accused, murderer or accused person of a crime to the court of law within the first 24 hours. He was then ultimately taken to court the following day, and he was charged with second-degree murder, which second-degree murder, is obviously premeditated. So he pled guilty to that, and there was never a trial held for Tanya's murder. He was just charged with this, and he was ultimately sentenced after his guilty plea for second-degree murder to, are y'all ready for this? Y'all ready for this? 11 years for the murder. 11 years. He was in there for 11 years. There's people in there who are in prison for crimes they didn't commit for life. And then he kills his own girlfriend, who was 15 at the time, and I think he was like 18 or 19. And this was obviously premeditated. He had that pocket knife ready, and he was killing her. And, he admitted to it, and they sent him to jail for 11 years. I mean, it's just so frustrating. It's just, I feel like the whole thing was absolutely atrocious. And they said justice was served because he went to jail for 11 years for the murder. No, justice was not served. Justice was not served. He should have been behind bars for the rest of his life. He shouldn't be out there enjoying his life while the 15-year-old girl that he was dating at the time lost hers over what? Like over a little fight they had? It just does not make any sense to me. Trying to calm down because man. Anyway, so I do want to add something. Like, I'm going to probably list down below any type of useful information that could be used for people who are victims of domestic violence and who feel like their lives are being threatened, because you can get help. Please do not stay in relationships that make you feel like you're in danger and make you feel unsafe. Please, even if you're young, 15, 16 years old, and you may think you're in love with someone, and they turn out to be this guy who wants to harm you over what? So, what are your thoughts about this case? Are you guys as frustrated about it as I am? Because, oh my god. My god, 11 years. Just, so frustrating. Oh my god. So, like I said, let me know your thoughts down below about this case down in the comments section. Don't forget to please like this video. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Hit that notification bell so that you never miss a video. And I hope to see you guys in my next video on Friday. Bye, guys.